Speaking world for the last 50 years. He has written numerous books, but he's particularly written a new book called The Making of a Marxist Philosopher, and I'll give that a plug at the end and put out these flyers, because if you have the flyer, the crucial thing is the top line. You get 20% discount on buying the book if you have this piece of paper in your hand, which I hope you'll want to do. So without more ado, if I can please just introduce, first of all, Professor Richard Sakwa, who's going to, in a sense, interview and spur on Sean Sayers to inspire us this evening. Please, can we welcome you? Okay.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for coming for this session. You've just taken some of my steam out. I was going to say a few words about Sean, but when I was thinking of how we could conduct this dialogue this evening, I was thinking of focusing or thinking in terms of having, as well, the theme, the worlds of Sean Sayers. And there's many worlds. In a few minutes, in a few seconds, I'm going to ask Sean to give a short introduction to this book, and indeed an introduction to his life and an introduction to the world in which we're living in. And there's many worlds, as you'll hear, which basically, as we shall see, I think overlap and make up the sort of mosaic of our times. And so I think it's an absolutely fascinating work. Here it is, and indeed it's available post-free. Sean adds if you do order it. So my first point element was indeed to ask Sean to just briefly, maybe 5-10 minutes maximum, just outline some of the key ideas and some of the key themes of the book.
Well, that's very. I mean, it covers a very large area, broad spectrum, because it's not only a biography, a memoir of myself. It's also of my family. I start with my grandparents, and then I talk about my parents, and then my own life, upbringing, and work here at Kent, and what I've done in retirement. So it covers a broad sweep of topic.
Yes, that's what I was asking. It does say, I don't think it was working, your mic, or it's not loud enough.
Can you come up and use the desk mic?
No, is this one maybe coming back to life?
Yeah, it's back to life now.
It's back to life now. So you can see
yeah, you can see it, it's back to life.
I don't mind standing in front of quite.
Yeah, okay. I'll take that one then.
All right.
Yeah, no, I was saying, I cover a broad sweep because I start with my it's not just about me, it's about my family as well. It's a family memoir. I start with my grandparents, then my parents, and then myself. And they were all much more interesting than I am, I feel. I mean, I had one job in the whole of my career at the University of Kent here, though I taught occasionally in other places on leave during that period. But they had, very much more, I guess, sort of, one person said exotic lives. My father's family came from Lithuania. My grandfather was a refugee when he was about 11. I think he went to Ireland, where he started out as a peddler, really the lowest rung of salesman, peddling clothing in the west of Ireland. But he was a very, very entrepreneurial man. He was extraordinarily successful business. He established a business there, a clothing business, then moved to Dublin and made quite a lot of money. Then he lost it all in the great crash of 1929, started a quite different business, selling greetings cards, and made another fortune. He had a very good ruse with these greetings cards. In America, they changed the Christmas cards every year. They had new designs of Christmas cards. So what he would do is wait till January, buy up all the old Christmas cards in America at absolute rock bottom price, bring them over here and sell them at an inflated price the next year. and made a fortune. He was a remarkably successful businessman. But he was also, and perhaps more interesting and more relevantly for the theme of my book, which is about my sort of left-wing ancestry and upbringing, he was a very strong supporter of the Republican cause in Ireland, and a very good friend, close friend of a lot of the Republican leadership, particularly of Michael Collins, who was the leader of the IRA. And he played an active role in the struggle for independence in Ireland. My father, was brought up in Ireland, was born in Ireland, born in Dublin, and wanted to be a writer. His father, in typical sort of Jewish fashion, wanted him to be a lawyer or a doctor, or something safe like that, but he wanted to be a writer. He sort of worked in the theatre. His father kept on making him go to college, but he kept sort of dropping out, and he became a writer. And then he came to London, and he sent his poetry to T.S. Eliot, and Eliot wrote the most amazingly supportive and helpful letter back to him. It's a 3-page letter giving him advice about his poetry. Really remarkably, and Eliot sort of took him under his wing. He was a theatre reviewer for Eliot's magazine journal, the Criterion, and then he became the theatre reviewer for the New English Weekly. He shared a flat for a while with George Orwell. He was very much part of the London literary world of the 30s, but he was very attracted to, I guess, the sort of a bigger success, the bright lights of America. So he came to New York and was doing well. He had a job on Broadway as helping in the theatre there. But this was just before the Second World War, and he got then involved in the struggle against Nazi fifth column activity in America, trying to keep America out of the Second World War. He became an expose journalist, and he wrote some very, very successful books. We lived off them for years, and then. When the America entered the war, he went back into the theatre, and then eventually wrote for TV. And he was a successful writer in those things. But then McCarthyism came along. He was blacklisted. He was working for NBC television. He was blacklisted. He couldn't get work in America, so he came to Europe. My parents separated at that point. He went to live in France mainly, and wrote quite a lot of TV, usually under anonymously under aliases. Wrote, if any people can remember this, he wrote quite a lot of Robin Hood series, which were very successful as well. Almost all of them, incidentally, were written by American exiles from McCarthyism, employed by a woman called Hannah Weinstein. She had I suspect she's a relative of Harvey Weinstein. I've never checked that. Anyway, she was, a benevolent figure for our family anyway. And on my mother's side, my mother's father was an extremely prominent anarchist, Italian, started out in Italy, but was exiled, first of all, internally from in Italy to Sicily, where he met my grandmother. They escaped and eventually made their way to America, where he became a very active anarchist in the Italian community in America. The Department of Justice in America called him the most dangerous anarchist in America, which I thought was a tremendous accolade that he received. He was, for people who know, he was the leader of the group of which Sacco and Vanzetti were part. Sacco and Vanzetti it was a very famous case that involved them. It was a it was a worldwide, created sort of worldwide attention. They were eventually executed, put in the electric chair in 1927. But by that time, my father had been deported from America. There were no, it was a period even worse in some ways. There was a sort of Red Scare after the First World War and after the Russian Revolution in America, a sort of anti-red hysteria. And when one sees the propaganda, the news, in that period, it's quite terrifying. Anyway, he and 4,000 other people were rounded up and deported without any charge. It was a purely administrative procedure, even though he'd lived in America for 20 years. He had family. My mother was born in America, and three of her siblings, which had been illegal to deport people like that. For people who lived in America, foreign people who were in America but had family born in America and hadn't committed any crimes, it had been illegal. But the Department of Justice actually changed the law specifically, as documents reveal, because of my grandfather, so that they could deport my grandfather. Anyway, they deported him back to Italy, where he was again put in. Then Mussolini came to power. He was internally exiled in Italy and died in the north of Tuscany. So I've got sort of illustrious left-wing grandparents, and my mother was born in America. She was she came from this anarchist family, but she became a communist in the 30s, which she felt always. There's always been a lot of conflict and tension between anarchists and communists historically, but she felt that in becoming the communists by that time were the main people who were carrying the fight against fascism, particularly in the 30s, and that she was, in a way, carrying on his struggle in becoming a communist. She had a very long interest in China. She worked for the China News Agency in London. And when we got to London, sorry, I'm not telling this very well. I should follow this through. Yeah, she after the war, when McCarthyism was starting, my parents separated. Me and my brother and my mother, we came to Europe. I don't know at that time whether the plan was to stay in Europe, but that's what did happen. We stayed in Europe eventually, lived in Italy for a year, in Ireland for a bit, and then came to London, where I grew up, and went to school in London, and went to university in Cambridge and Oxford, as Peter mentioned, and then got my job here in Canterbury. So that's where I grew up. But I had this left-wing background, and my mother was always interested in China, always had a connection with China. And at the very end of the Cultural Revolution, in 1973, she had the opportunity of going to work in China for the new China News Agency, which she took. She went to work in Beijing for 3 years, and in 1974, still during the Cultural Revolution, I had the opportunity to visit her in China. There was no tourism at that time. It was a really remarkable thing to do. I mean, there was just nobody except businessmen really went to China. And that really it inspired me enormously and changed my life. And I've had a long interest in China ever since then. I've taught quite a lot in China, and that's had a profound influence on me. Well, I think that's probably enough, isn't it?
For the time being. Thanks so much. It's working. Amazing. It wasn't working, and it was, and it is again now. So thanks so much for that introduction. We'll come back to some of the themes in a minute. Can I just ask the first, when looking at your book, is the actual art of autobiography. So when you were writing this, it's a relatively slim volume, and yet even what you've said just in these last few minutes, it's covering so many issues: China, anarchism, communism, and so much China coming back to study and work in the United Kingdom and so on. So could you just say a few words about when you set about, and first of all, why did you decide now that it was time to do this? And then how did you then, because you could have put in so much more.
Yes.
And then what principle of leaving things out and what you decided to put in?
Okay, well, it sort of happened rather gradually writing this book. First of all, I had no idea. I had almost no knowledge of my family when I was growing up, and we were in England, and most of my family was in America, in Italy. I had really no contact with my family, no knowledge of my family. But I knew, because my mother told me that, her father was a famous anarchist, but I just didn't know much more than that about it. It didn't really mean much to me when I was growing up. When I started to get interested in my own family history about the time I was retiring, I think. I can't remember, and I can't remember why I began to get interested. But I thought, well, I'll look up this man. His name was Luigi Galliani. I'll look him up on the internet, see if there's anything there. And I was absolutely astounded. I mean, he's an extremely well-known and important figure in American, not just in left-wing history, in American history. Because the case that he was, the people that I mentioned, Sacco Vanzetti, was really one of the most notorious and famous cases in the whole of American legal history. So I got interested in him, and then me and my wife, we were on holiday. We went on holiday near where he died, and I thought, oh, well, I'll go in, we'd been shopping one Saturday morning. I thought we'll drop into the local library and see if they got any newspapers of that period. And they said, oh, God, no, we haven't got anything as old as that. You'd have to go to the provincial capital, Florence, for that. But why don't you try the State Archive, which is in the next town in Carrara. So we went down there, and there was this very sort of blank building with a brass plate on the door saying Archivio di Stato, State Archives, knocked on the door. Somebody eventually, I was just about to give up, and somebody eventually opened the door a crack and said, what do you want? And I spoke virtually no Italian. I said, I want documenti sur mio nonno, my grandfather, Luigi Galliani. And the man sort of looked as a vague recognition. He said, momento, vanished inside, and then he invited us in and presented us with these enormous folders of police reports on him. And he'd been, every day of, that he was there, he was under, there was a police guard outside his house. He was under police surveillance. Every single day they wrote a report. They wrote it in quadruplicate, in fact. This is the Italian bureaucracy for you, or the fascist bureaucracy. Sent some of them to Rome and some of them to the state capital and so forth. And even if they said, as they often did, there's nothing to report, he did no activity of any significance happened today. But every single day of of his time there, there was a report, and they confiscated, they opened his letters, which were in handwriting, from my family in America, from his wife and my mother and her siblings, and very helpfully, remarkably, typed them out, because they were almost unreadable. So they were all typed out. And they confiscated all sorts of other things, which I couldn't understand why. I mean, my family had sent him copies of Time magazine and Reader's Digest, which are in there as well. It was just, I mean, it was just amazing. So I thought, oh, this is, you know, I really got quite excited by this sort of research, which is way away from, you know, not the sort of thing I'd ever done before. So on subsequent holidays in Italy, it was a lovely reason to sort of go to various bits of Italy where he'd been active or in prison or whatever. And in each of these, there was an archive, and we, you know, I began to build up a lot of information about him. I thought, I'll write, and there was already a biography of him, which was extremely stodgy and tedious. So I thought, I can do better than this. I'll write a biography of him. And I learnt Italian, and I started to read about him. And, but I realized that, I mean, first of all, his Italian. He was a journalist, basically. He actually published a newspaper when he was in America, in Vermont first, and then in Boston. It had the wonderful title, it seems wonderful to me, it was called Cronaca Sovversiva, which means subversive chronicle. It was, he wrote a lot of it himself. He was, and his prose was incredibly difficult. I mean, Italian is not a terribly difficult language, basically, but his prose was extraordinarily full of metaphors and images, and you know, and this is typical of Italian, actually, with, you know, paragraphs that went on for a page, and really, you know, I had to sort of parse them before I could begin to translate them. So I realized, and there was just I was just inundated by material, which is very, you know, most biographers have difficulty finding material. I had the opposite problem. I was just completely swamped by it. And eventually I realized, and I didn't have enough sort of background in Italian history. So I was just about to give up when I talked to a friend of ours whose husband was a prominent anarchist here in England, Colin Ward. And she put me in touch with an Italian man in Bologna who was interested in writing a biography of my grandfather. So I met him, and I gave my material to him eventually, and he wrote what's a very good biography, and I translated it then into English. But he wrote a biography of him. So I've lost my thread.
Yeah. So in other words, you didn't do the biography of Bergeliani, but you did it of yourself.
That's right. Yes. I mean, writing. You know, writing the I mean, I started. You know, so I started. You know, getting interested in my grandfather Galliani, and then quite separately, in some of my visits to China, some of the people I was in contact with, you would interview me about my own thought and my own development. So I had quite a lot of material about that by that time. And I thought I'll put the two, you know, I mean, I'll eventually, it was during lockdown actually. I thought, what am I going to do during lockdown? I put the, you know, I thought I'll put the two together. I'll write a memoir which covers my grandparents and my parents and myself. So that's how it developed, and then I just did it.
One of the early parts talks about what Tolstoy said, you know, childhood, boyhood, youth.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating account of north of London in the early post-war years.
Yeah.
So. I just wanted to say a bit more about that, certain friendships which continued. And one thing which was interesting is that, for example, you talk about, you left school assemblies in the morning.
Yeah.
and would go with, same as I did actually, it's Catholics and Jews. Were, and you put yourself down as an atheist.
Well, I
would
mean,
leave the
I had a
service.
completely secular upbringing, totally secular.
So
And I went to a progressive primary school where the issue of religion just never came up. But when I got to grammar school in London, they asked me, what religion are you? And I literally had no idea what to answer. I said, I don't know. They said, okay, we'll put you down as C of E. And I didn't know what that meant either, but I thought I better not ask. So I went back and asked my mother, what is C of E? And she said, Church of England. I said, are we that? And she said, no. I said, well, what religion are we? And she said, well, we don't have a religion. we're atheists. And I knew, that wasn't. I wanted to be like everybody else. There weren't any other atheists in the class. I want a religion, And my father was Jewish, though secularly. I mean, he wasn't religiously Jewish. So my mother said, well, he's Jewish. And so the school had a third Jewish people. It had a Jewish assembly as well as a Christian assembly. So I thought, okay, I'll be Jewish. So I said, I went back to school and said, I'm Jewish. But then I went to the Jewish assembly, and it was full of people. This will sound terribly prejudiced, and I perhaps shouldn't say it, but I mean, it was full of people sort of nodding like this and incanting in Hebrew. It felt so totally alien. I thought, this is not me. I'm not Jewish. At least I'm not religiously Jewish. I really thought it horrified me, quite honestly. I thought, I don't speak this language. I don't know what this is all about. I can't possibly pretend to be Jewish. So and we had an absolutely terroristic, horrible divinity teacher. He was he just ruled the class by terror. So I thought, well, if I'm atheist, I can sit at the back of the class and I wouldn't have to do divinity lessons either. So I became a sort of registered atheist. And there was a funny little room. I mean, apart from the Jewish assembly and the Christian assembly, there was the atheist room, where we all, and there were about 10 of us. We didn't have any Catholics there. They must have gone into the Christian assembly. But we did have a couple of Sikhs. I mean, this is North London. There were very, very few, not strangely, at that time, non-Christian people. So there were a couple of Sikhs. There was another communist exile from McCarthyism, an American kid, and I can't remember who there were. There were like a dozen of us at the most. So we sat out the assembly, the religious part of the assembly, in the atheist room, and then trooped in for the announcements and all that. And frankly, I regret that. I mean, I mean, it's even if I mean, first of all, we were from America, and as I said, atheists had no idea that Church of England religion, belief is an optional extra. Nobody believed in it. It didn't matter. So the fact that we didn't believe in it really wouldn't have mattered. I regret now that I didn't go to assembly, because knowing about Christian religion is part of cultural knowledge, which I always feel lack.
As a Catholic, I also left, so it wasn't quite Christian. It was divisions within, as it were. I was going to ask a little bit about your time in London, but maybe people should look at the book. I mean, you have vivid descriptions of bombed-out sites and the sort of freedom, people relaxed. I mean, it was terrible, hard times, but and your family house, a lot of great centre for discussion and community.
Yes, it was. I mean, again, I guess because we were foreigners. I mean, there were a lot of American exiles in London, a lot of exiles from McCarthyism in London, and most of my family's friends were various, foreigners, but very, cultural, educated, intellectual people. It was a very lively environment. People were always talking about novels and films and theatre, and and being in North London was terrific. I mean, it was a wonderful time to be growing up. It was a very exciting, there was a lot of political activity. We were close to the London Theatre. I started going to the theatre a lot. It was films. It was, every Friday, the Everyman Theatre in Hampstead. I'd be able to go, just go up there, and somebody I could, there was always people in the queue that I could sort of join, and it was wonderful, good times. Yeah.
It's a vivid evocation of a world that seems to have gone. That sort of lively public sphere, and also a sense that the zeitgeist, that even though things were tough, things were worth doing in art, culture, politics, and so on.
Absolutely, yeah.
We'll come back to that, but just, your title of the book is The Making of a Marxist Philosopher. First, I just want to ask about the title, The Making. Is this a deliberate nod to E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, it is. And the theme of Thompson's book is, which is about the formation of the English working class, particularly before unions, but during the time of the Luddites and the sort of early agricultural uprisings and things. And Thompson's theme is how that, he rejects, or he doesn't want to, he doesn't want to accept a sort of determinism. He's not saying that these people were, by their economic or political circumstances determined to take the form of protest that they did. They were actively reacting to the situation they found themselves in, and he very much wants to stress that. And I try in my book to stress that, although I came from a very left-wing family background, it also presented me with choices, and I had to actively respond to that. My mother's politics, for example, and my father's politics were really very different. They were both on the left, but they were very different, so I had to make those choices.
Then you went to Cambridge and studied philosophy,
Yes.
but maybe a few words about that. It wasn't our good continental philosophy, but as I understand it, it was rather more, what Pierre Manning, philosopher, says, rather more desiccated type of philosophy, putting Kant and Hegel apart, pulling them apart and then putting them together, as it were.
Hegel was never mentioned. The history of philosophy, this was British philosophy, it still is, as a matter of fact, pretty much. Continental philosophy, of which Hegel is the great villain, was completely excluded. The history of philosophy went, there were the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and then there was a 1,000-year gap until Descartes and, European philosophy started, Descartes, Hobbes and Locke and people, up to Kant. Descartes to Kant was the period of the history of philosophy. Then there was another, then things, just went dead again. There was a total silence until Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore and Wittgenstein, resumed philosophy in the beginning of the 20th century in Cambridge.
But you took the analytical path.
I was, at the time, my training was in analytical philosophy. I was very much into it. I was very, excited by it. I must say, although it was extraordinarily narrow, the syllabus in Cambridge, I did history of philosophy, so that's why I've described it. But for modern work, we really read nothing that wasn't published in either Oxford, Cambridge, London, or Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was, it was extraordinarily narrow, the range of work that we studied, but we studied it with incredible, rigorous seriousness, and I got an extremely good education, I think, both in the history of philosophy, of what we did a bit, and in just argument. Argument. It was a very argumentative subject as it was taught. And the Cambridge department, which was very small, half a dozen teachers, I think, was divided into 3 warring factions. And there was the Wittgensteinians. I was part of that group, and then there were the people who followed G.E. Moore, Mooreans, and then there was another type of Wittgensteinian. We didn't regard them as proper Wittgensteinians, but anyway. And the teachers were all warring, literally arguing with each other, putting on lectures against each other, and the students lined up behind them, and it was extremely stimulating. I mean, we were in constant argument. It was great. It was brilliant. I really got a very good education, but it was extremely narrow. And then when I left Cambridge and became a graduate student, I had extraordinary freedom as a graduate student. I mean, nobody wanted to supervise. If you left the supervisors alone, they were only too happy. I had time, and I was a serious student to read and educate myself in all the things that I hadn't been educated in as an undergraduate.
So is this the PhD you started at Oxford?
I started a PhD. Initially, my interests were in Freud, or it was R.D. Laing, if people remember him, Ronnie Laing, who really inspired me. And from Laing, I got, I thought, I'd read Freud because he was a psychoanalytic writer. And then it was only at that time, it was really only in that period also that I read the first work of Marx that I read as a graduate student. I never read Marx. I grew up in a Marxist household, and therefore, it was just a reaction against my mother that I never read any Marx earlier. But I read Marx, and it really did excite me. And then later, it was really coming here and starting to teach here in the and getting together with Tony Skillen and Richard Norman. That we began to sort of try and organise a movement and then a journal criticising analytical philosophy and broadening out the scope of British philosophy. We published a journal called Radical Philosophy here, which was very influential. I think it provided a forum for critique of analytical philosophy and other sorts of philosophy that simply, couldn't be expressed at that time anywhere else. And that was at that point that I started reading Hegel as well.
Thanks so much. Just to go back to the thesis, which fascinates me, because that was you published it later as a book, Reality and Reason.
Reality and Reason.
Which
yeah.
I know, given such an academic audience, we won't go. Earlier, I was going to say we'll talk about the dialectic, and Sean said no, keep away from it. But we will go to the dialectic in a minute. But yeah. I am interested in this. This was, you say, I think the book you say you're most proud of.
Yeah.
So maybe just give us a few words about the main argument of this book, because having looked at it, it looks fascinating insofar as I understand it. Maybe you.
Well, it's a book about the central area of at least English language philosophy since in modern times, which is theory of knowledge. But it's trying to it's arguing for a realist position in the theory of knowledge. I do believe that there is a reality, an objective reality out there that we can grasp and understand in subjective and theoretical terms, and that's what it's arguing for. But it's using Hegel and Marx to do so, and it also a great deal of it. What came into it from my work as a graduate student was there's a lot about psychoanalysis in it as well, justifying, arguing that psychoanalysis should be taken seriously as a realist theory of the mind, as describing not simply metaphorical ideas, which is how psychoanalysis is often interpreted these days, but real forces that are at work in the mind. And so it takes that sort of realist line on psychoanalysis.
I'm simplifying it, but would you say that ultimately you're arguing for a classic modernist view against postmodernism?
Yes.
The relativism and so on.
So
it's
absolutely. And
foundational.
that's the other important theme in the book. You know, it's arguing again. It's arguing. I mean, what it's trying to do is argue for a I mean, I believe that knowledge and understanding are historical, but not relativistic. You know, it's historical, but there are objective reality, bases of knowledge at each period. So it's modernist, but historical. I mean, that's the important theme.
which perhaps gives the philosophical foundations to your Marxism, which is...
Yes,
Before we go to that, I know people will be jolly disappointed if we didn't go to the dialectic. I gather this was a big debate you had with your colleague, Richard Norman. In fact, I think you published a book.
We published a book together, the first book I published, yeah.
Which was basically articles by you and by Richard, which was basically both in favour of... Well, first of all, why do you philosophers just call it dialectic? We, in politics, always call it the dialectic. Is the difference the dialectic was a sense that, you know, it's a teleological, it's going somewhere, whereas dialectic is a methodological point?
I don't know. I don't, you know, I mean, I've always, I think, in fact, in that book, I call it dialectics with a S on the end.
Why?
And I've never been, it's always been slightly fluid, the way I've described it. I mean, I wouldn't want to call it the dialectic, because there are, you know, dialectic is a form of philosophy that occurs, you know, it starts with the ancient, with Plato, and yeah, you know, and ancient, you know, it's part of ancient philosophy. There are various different versions of dialectic, and Hegel's dialectic, and Marxist, I mean, although Marx is very strongly based in Hegel's philosophy, Marxist philosophy and Marxist dialectic is different from Hegel, so I'm not sure what I wouldn't want to call it the dialectic.
Well, the old left used to say, don't forget the dialectic. Which was saying the onward march of history.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which you don't go for.
No.
No, indeed. We'll leave that. We could explore the methodological thing, but I mean
my
what was the
interest
difference
in the
with you and Richard Norman?
Oh, a lot. I mean, I'm a Hegelian, and what I mean by that is I believe that that dialectical philosophy is a philosophy which is basically critical of the fundamental assumptions of a great deal of modern British philosophy, analytic philosophy, which Richard was basically defending, whereas I was criticizing it. And I mean, the fundamental point that I think comes out of dialectic, Hegel's dialectic, which is really contrary to a great deal of contemporary English language philosophy, but also a lot of continental philosophy. The fundamental thoughts are that everything is in a process of change and development, and that everything is in relation to other things, and must be seen in the context of other things within a larger totality. It's those two ideas which seem very sort of I don't know, sort of simple and innocent and almost banal, but when they're worked out in philosophical terms, lead one to the view that in order to understand things in their concrete reality as changing and as in relation, you've got to see them as involving contradiction, and that's where it becomes more That's where I guess the real difference between Richard and myself, emerges.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's contradiction and dialectic. Obviously, there's a huge literature which I think is fascinating on a different view, dialogue and dialectic. Dimitri Nikunu. But I'm sure that people may leave that for a moment. I want to go two more big things before we open Q&A. First one is you say you came to Marxism relatively late, in the sense not at boyhood. Obviously, you say it's the making of a Marxist philosopher. So what's the difference between a normal philosopher and a Marxist philosopher?
Well, I mean, there's no such thing as a normal philosopher.
That's been our observation.
Not in the sense that we're abnormal, but in the sense that, philosophy comes in different forms and different types. I actually started as an undergraduate, and in school I was doing natural sciences. I did physics, maths, and chemistry when I was in school, and then in my first year of university I did physics and maths. And when then I changed at the end of my first year to philosophy. And the wonderful thing I thought in philosophy is that there's no right answer. In maths, they set you a problem and there's a right answer, and if you get it right, you're right, and if you get it wrong, you're wrong. But when they ask you set an essay question in philosophy, there is no right answer. And that was, I felt, a tremendous liberation. And and there's no normal philosophy therefore. There are to any philosophical issue, whether there's a sort of objective morality or whether we have free will or whatever, any sort of philosophical question you like to take, there are different philosophies with different answers. And as a student of philosophy, one's not asked to give the correct answer, because there is no such thing. What one's asked to do is to answer the question set, is there free will, for example, whatever it is, and whatever position you take, to state it clearly and defend it with good arguments. That's, but there can be different positions and different arguments. There is no normal philosophy.
Yeah. We have to move on, but I just want to say, from the Marxist and Hegelian Marx, Hegel and Marx, obviously very optimistic philosophies, which is, I think, is imbued in your book, and I can't remember, page 42 or whatever, on Buddhism, refusing to accept, the circularity of history and a sense that it's going somewhere.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, obviously you spent some time in China, you've, maybe not an expert on the Soviet Union, but nevertheless, the 20th century is marked by an attempt to apply Marxism in very different situations than perhaps he envisaged, and the outcome was, to put it mildly, mixed. And obviously, I think one of the critiques people make of your work, perhaps, would be, that Hegelian Marxist optimism that ultimately a positive outcome. So, your evaluation of, the actual existing socialism in the countries you've studied, in particular China.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, China is a very difficult and interesting case. What's usually said about Soviet Marxism is it was a catastrophe and disaster, which I don't accept. But people don't say that about China. China, the outcome is much more checkered and mixed. I mean, there were periods of disastrous events in China, but basically, the history of China has been one of tremendous progress. I mean, China today. I mean, the changes I've seen in my time. I've been visiting China for 50 years. Are absolutely extraordinary. I mean, when I first went to China, it was an agrarian society. 80% of the people lived off the land. There was no machinery even working the land. Everything was done by hand. 80% of the population worked on the land. Life was poor, very poor, but and simple. But nobody, everybody was clothed, everybody was housed, everybody, there was health services of some sort, even in the rural areas. There was people who were educated, and that was the work of Chinese communism. I mean, when you compared the situation then in the 1970s in China to any other third world country, and that's what China was at the time, I mean, there was no question, I think, that communism had brought the civil war to an end in China, that it had done enormous good. Now, what's happened since then, it's had a very checkered and mixed history, and I'm not an expert on Chinese society and Chinese history, and I don't speak Chinese, so, my knowledge is limited, but, there have been periods of catastrophic, I think, disorder and the Cultural Revolution, which, as I say, I was even in China at the end of the Cultural Revolution, was utterly perplexing. But it was a period of chaos and disorder, verging on civil war. It seemed to be just sort of factions. I never could understand it, never did understand, and still don't understand really what was going on. And then when China emerged out of the Cultural Revolution into the period of what Deng Xiaoping and what they call opening to that's to say to the capitalist West of them and the capitalist market. Although the Chinese still want to call themselves socialist communists, communism with Chinese characteristics, as they nicely put it, I think it would be just as accurate to call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics. In many respects, it's a capitalist society, and yet it's different. I mean, it has a much greater degree of state control, and it isn't pure capitalism, but I don't think one could call it socialism. So it's been a very, but I mean the history of China, although it has had its disastrous periods, is a history of real development and progress. I don't think one could doubt that.
Some people call it nowadays Confucianism with Marxist characteristics, which would be another.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's it's coming from a very different cultural place, and there is that sort of Confucian element.
I mean, there's so much more we can talk about. I'm cognizant of time. We haven't talked about your time and your views on higher education, which I think is an interesting topic, particularly at the University of Kent. But just to finish before we open up to Q&A, is your book sort of has a theme running through it all the time, but in particular towards the end. It's a hard question. I'm thinking in terms of your vision of the future of socialism in 110, because that is, in a sense, was the Marxist philosophy. The intersection of radical movements, anarchism, and then various Marxist movements and so on. Interesting. You make all sorts of comments, which I could pick up. Why did you think New Left Review was elitist, for example? That sort of session. But really, today, at the end, you're so implicitly saying that the talk of revolution is not over, that the story still continues, and that Hegelian Marxist dialectic still is working. Perhaps the cunning of history is so cunning that we can't see it, but maybe somewhere along the line. So just your final view before we open up.
Yes, I do believe it's still running, and I do believe we can't see it. Because it seems. I would describe my belief in communism, socialism, as a faith now. Quite honestly, as I can't point. I do believe that capitalism, I mean, I think one of Marx's greatest insights is that capitalism was a particular stage of history. It isn't you know, the world according to human nature, which is, you know, it's not that people are naturally inclined to truck and barter, as Adam Smith said. You know, we aren't naturally competitive and self-interested in the way that sort of capitalist ideology, if you like, portrays it. Capitalism is a particular stage of history. It came into being at a certain time, at the beginning of the modern period. It has a historical development, a natural development, and it will, I believe, come to an end. But and it seems to me that the economic side of Marxism, showing that it's got insoluble conflicts and contradictions within it, which cannot be resolved within the capitalist system, I think that's been amply demonstrated by the whole history of capitalism. What's more in question and what's more difficult for Marxists is Marx's also view that, you know, an economic crisis alone is not going to bring down the capitalist system. It needs the development of political forces within capitalist societies which will eventually either, you know, revolt against it and replace it. And at the present, anyway, in the world there are no serious political forces challenging capitalism in any very deep way. And that, you know, so I can only say I have the faith that those forces will develop, because it seems to me that capitalism won't, you know, that it's so full of conflict and crisis, it won't last forever, it can't last forever. And sooner or later, you know, there's a great deal of resentment and opposition to the conditions that people live in, but it just has not been able to form any, to coalesce and form any sort of politically effective form. But if you like, the tinder is all there. It just needs somehow to be ignited. Now, how, I don't know. That's my faith that it will be. And I can't, you know, if you say, well, prove it, you know, where do you see this? Well, it's invisible. We don't see it. But I do have the faith that it will come.
Well, all things have a beginning and an end, and that in our case, the end of this part. So Q&A, please. There's so much to talk about. The book covers so much of the 20th century, both life and thought. So anybody who'd like to start about, yeah? So are you going to...
You might need to use the microphone.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, you said something about these sort of intellectual differences between your grandfather and your mother, for example. I wonder if you'd like to reflect a bit on the intellectual climate of the left, how that has shifted and changed. Were those changes and differences?
Can you speak up a bit, actually?
Sorry, there are those differences, the changes that took place between the 1930s and the 50s. And I think in terms of your own career as a member of the intellectual left,
Yeah.
what observations would you like to share with us around how that intellectual culture has shifted in the last 50 years between the
Well, I mean,
1970s and the current time? How you think that has changed? And I assume you see it's not as a forward march of intellectual culture of the left. And perhaps you might think about offer some observations about the reasons perhaps why that shift has taken place. And at the same time, perhaps offer suggestions as to what the high points of socialist intellectual gifts to us, you know, the best of the socialist left. What would you say they've been over this period of time? And if you want to as well, what the worst?
gosh, well, that's a lot of questions.
I think
But I mean, shall I?
Yeah, I was going to say, to sum up for people who didn't quite catch it, as far as I understand it, two questions. First, the shifting, the differences in intellectual climate all the way back from the 50s to today. And the second one, what was was the second one.
The second one is obviously the ones that mention about the reasons for those changes.
Yeah.
I'm thinking not actually between the 50s and now, I'm thinking since the 1970s, when you first started work as a philosopher here in Canterbury, and the present period, it seems to me that a dramatic shift has taken place in that period. I would want to comment on that, not any thoughts about why it's changed so radically.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think in the 70s still, but I mean, going back a bit further. I mean, my formation was also earlier in the 60s, really. In the left in the 60s, CND and anti-apartheid and things like that. But an enormous. I mean, even in the 70s, but certainly in the 60s, the main force on the radical, on the far left, if you like, was the Communist Party. I mean, it still was an enormously influential organisation and influence. Absolutely everything had to be related to Soviet communism in one way or another. Chinese communism, I mean, one of the big first changes there was the Sino-Soviet split. And because my mother was, I grew up in a household where my mother was a communist, she followed the Chinese during that period. That was a very important, intellectual divide, the first real divide within the international communist movement. And then after the 60s, though, with the 60s, you had the rise of all sorts of other forces, civil rights, the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War, anti-colonial movement. And the left, in a sense you might say, fragmented. I mean, the Communist Party, the Orthodox Soviet Communist Party, lost a great deal of its influence and eventually, of course, vanished altogether. But, there was a tremendous flowering at the same time of different strands of left-wing thought. And it seems to me that, left ideas which were really confined at the time, far left ideas, Marxist ideas, were confined certainly in the 60s and even in the early 70s, confined to communist groups. There was no Marxism. When I started teaching here, Marxism wasn't on the syllabus in virtually any subject in the university. I mean, we brought it in philosophy with the founding of the journal Radical Philosophy, which we founded in this university, which was one of the real achievements, I think, that we did. But I mean, it was following I mean, that was in the air then. We just gave it a voice, or a place to be expressed. So, although the monolithic sort of influence of the international communist movement broke up, but there was a tremendous sort of, on the other hand, flowering, I think, of other left-wing and Marxist-tinged, Marxist-influenced tendencies. I think the intellectual influence of Marx is far, far greater now, although it's taken this very fragmented, different form, far, far greater now than it was in the 70s. That's how I'd say the real change has come. Now, what are the high points of that? Well, gosh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can give you. I mean, I think in Britain anyway, and this is again going back a bit, but I think the first and most important contribution that Marxists have made to English intellectual culture have been the historians, Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill, E.P. Thompson. I mean, they've had, they really, it was a body of work which is of, enduring significance and really brought a whole new perspective into history, but more widely into the way we see ourselves.
Okay. Any immediate questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is not working, is it?
I'll try to project. Sean, I was just wondering if you could reflect on sort of the collapse of philosophy at Kent. Because to me, if Marxism is possible, we need sort of an active and an informed civil society. And one of the changes at the moment is that higher education is really coming under threat. And, thought is under threat. And I was just wondering if you could sort of say, how do you see this developing? What should civil society do to kind of fight against, the sort of the collapse of philosophical thought?
Yeah, and intellectual. I mean, I think there's been a terrible defeat of intellectual thought, actually, in the universities, in the humanities and the social sciences, anyway, over the last period. And I would put it down to the sort of the influence of sort of me.
Is that one word?
That's my question.
I mean, in the universities, I think it's the I'm just trying to think of the words now. The sort of the fact that it's become sort of the sort of influence of sort of neoliberalism in the university. The way that everything is now made into a sort of marketable commodity. I mean, the effect on intellectual life of the RAE and then the RAF, the fact that every bit of supposed research has to be sort of assessed and quantified. That sort of ethos, and judged essentially in marketable terms. I mean, that's been terribly damaging within the universities. But there's been a wider collapse there's been a wider collapse of intellectual life and the left since the 60s. I mean, the 60s was a high point, I think, of a sort of tremendous flowering intellectually, and although the effect of the universities didn't really work itself out until the 70s, it was really the after effects of the 60s. But the whole effect of sort of ultra capitalism on the universities and on intellectual life, that's what I'd put it down to.
You think really that's right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. So.
Like all discussions, I have to emphasise that it'll carry on in the bar afterwards, to which everyone, of course, is invited. But I'd just like to say some words of thanks for our speaker and the dialogue we've had today. If any of you were involved in student politics in the late 60s and early 70s, as I was, and if you wanted to be a student leader in politics, that was the time to be involved in student politics. And I can remember being myself, of course, both a president of the union and a member of the National Union of Students, and we sat round a table with names like Charles by Trevor Phillips and Jack Straw and Mandelson and Cunningham and Charles Clark. I'm sure history, looking back, would say we were almost Blair's cabinet in waiting, really. But one of the characters one came across there, and he was president of the National Union of Students after my time of involvement, and it was David Aronovich. And he, I remember, wrote a very interesting book about his family life, talking about how he grew up in a Marxist family and his reflections upon it. And I read that with great interest. And I've listened with great interest your following story, which also I will read. It's always inspiring to hear what influences affect people, what challenges they make because of that on our own generation. And I just want to thank you for giving us some ideas and some thoughts, and above all, looking after us this evening. Can I say thank you very much? Thank you. Yes, I will go do that. If I can just make just two or three very short little announcements. The first is to say that your committee has got some definite plans for this coming spring term and into the summer. We have another book talk, if that's the way to describe it, planned, which your committee, which meets last week. Our Emeritus Professor Peter Gooby has written a new book called Immigrant Queen. Aspasia, who many of you may know, was hated as a foreigner, despised as a woman, and became the first lady of Athens because she married Pericles. And he will give an account of her life, her troubles, and some of the stories, I'm sure, and the rumours about her. So that we will publicise. Some of you heard me talk about 9 months ago, my involvement, I thought via my father, of SOE, the Special Operations Executive, and I made reference there to one of the events near the end of the war, which was the bombing of Amiens prison called Operation Jericho. And it's an interest that I have in that subject, but also Stephen Burke, who, historian here, has also got a particular interest in it. And the two of us are going to collaborate and produce an evening in which, with illustrations, we'll tell you that story as to why the prison was bombed, or why we think it was bombed, because all the documents of it, like some things in the war, are still under wraps and nobody really knows. But also at the same time, we're hoping to have a lunchtime music event taking place in the Gulbenkian. We hope to have, we've kindly in the past had a lambing session, and that depends very much when the lambs come along and whether the farmer will let us go there. We also have plans, if we can, to go to the Painted House in Dover, which is being restored, as well as other talks in the coming summer. So we are trying, as I said, to make out a programme for you. I hope you're able to get the information via the web and the emails we send out. Slowly, we are trying to improve that. We now have a Facebook page for those who might be of a slightly younger disposition. But each way, we're trying to make sure that the information does get out. If you're one of those people, and we always find them at every meeting, who is not getting our information, please do let Kesh know, and we'll add you to the list and try and make sure that it improves week by week. But the final plug is, of course, to, and I'll leave these at the front because about the book, we've just been hearing about the making of a Marxist philosopher, and the crucial phrase I mentioned at the top of the page, that if you have the flyer and would like to buy the book, you get a 20% discount. And that is obviously very attractive. I'll leave them here, and then I'll bring them with me to the bar in a few moments' time as well. So thank you once more for being with us this evening, and thank you for our speaking world for the last 50 years. He has written numerous books, but he's particularly written a new book called The Making of a Marxist Philosopher, and I'll give that a plug at the end and put out these flyers, because if you have the flyer, the crucial thing is the top line. You get 20% discount on buying the book if you have this piece of paper in your hand, which I hope you'll want to do. So without more ado, if I can please just introduce, first of all, Professor Richard Sakwa, who's going to, in a sense,